We meet her at 19 years old, standing alone on a rutted road with a single trunk at her feet and nowhere left to call home. Her name was Clementine Ashcroft, and the man who cast her out was her own uncle, Bertram Ashcroft, who had used a signature she never gave and a judge too far away to question it, to strip her of the only shop her late father had ever owned. She had $9 folded inside her glove, a leather awl that had belonged to her father, and a determination that refused to bend even though everything else around her had. 4 days later, in the town of Briar Hollow, Montana Territory, at a salvage sale nobody with sense attended, she paid $5 for a broken-down, wheel-shattered stagecoach that had sat rotting behind the old freight yard for as long as anyone could remember, and the men gathered their laugh at her for spending good money on a dead man's wreck. It looked, to every eye but hers, like the last desperate act of a girl with nothing left to lose. But sealed within that ruined wood was something that had waited 100 years to be found, something that would not only rebuild the life stolen from her, but would settle a debt the whole town of Briar Hollow never knew it carried. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clementine Ashcroft. If you have ever been told you were too young to be believed, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Clementine had been raised in the back rooms of a saddlery on the edge of Briar Hollow, in a narrow clapboard building that smelled always of neat's foot oil and cut leather, where her father, Warren Ashcroft, had built a modest but honest trade repairing harness and tack for the ranchers and freighters who passed through the valley. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had been Warren who raised her, and Warren who, rather than sending her off to relatives or apprenticing her out to some more conventional trade, kept her close at his workbench from the time she was old enough to hold an awl without cutting herself. He taught her to read leather the way some men read faces, to run her thumb along a strap and know, before her eyes had even finished the survey, where the fibers had begun to fail, where a stitch would hold and where it would not, where a thing that looked finished and whole was in fact quietly rotting from within. He taught her, too, something less practical and more essential, which was patience, the particular, unhurried patience of a craftsman who understood that rushing a repair only guaranteed you would be repairing it again. Value, he told her more than once, sitting across the bench from her with his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, was rarely obvious. Most people looked at a cracked bridle or a split saddle skirt and saw only trash. Warren saw possibility, and by the time Clementine was 14, she had begun to see it too. She grew up quick in the ways a girl must when she is the only child of a widower running a small business in a rough country, learning to keep the shop's accounts as well as her father's hands, learning to deal fairly and firmly with men 3 times her age who occasionally mistook her youth for softness, and learning, above all, the particular dignity of honest work done well regardless of who was watching. Briar Hollow in those years was a modest cattle and freight town tucked along the Copper River, with a single main street of false-fronted buildings, a Lutheran chapel with a bell that rang crooked, and a freight line, the old Copper Ridge line, that had once run coaches through the valley before the railroad, made such coaches obsolete, and left their routes to gather dust in local memory. Clementine had grown up hearing old-timers speak of the Copper Ridge coaches the way people speak of things half myth and half memory, stories of drivers and hold-ups, and a hard winter passage through Widow's Notch that had claimed more than one outfit in its time. Though by the time she was grown, the coaches themselves were nothing but rumor and rust, and nobody troubled themselves to separate the true stories from the tall ones. Her father died when she was 18, thrown from a spook horse on an errand to deliver a mended harness, and Clementine buried him in the small cemetery behind the chapel, with a grief so large it frightened her, and a fear larger still, because she understood, standing at that graveside at 18 years old with no mother, no siblings, and no one but herself, that the whole of her young life now rested on her own 2 hands. She kept the saddlery running through that first hard year alone, and she did it well. Well enough that by 19 she had begun, cautiously, to believe she might actually manage, might actually keep the small inheritance of skill and reputation her father had left her, might build something of her own out of what he had started. It was that fragile, hard-won confidence that made what came next so much crueler, because it was not misfortune or accident that took the shop from her in the end. It was her own uncle. Bertram Ashcroft was her father's older brother, a man who had spent most of his adult life drifting between minor schemes in Helena and Butte, always one venture behind, wherever the real money was, and who arrived in Briar Hollow within a month of Warren's funeral with an unsettling warmth in his manner and an even more unsettling interest in the shop's modest but steady income. He was, Clementine would later understand, exactly the kind of man who looked at a 19-year-old girl running a business alone and saw not a proprietor, but an opportunity, a minor in most practical, if not strictly legal senses, unmarried, unprotected, easily maneuvered by a relative willing to invoke family duty in one breath and legal guardianship in the next. He produced, within weeks, a paper before the county magistrate in the next township over, a paper claiming that Warren Ashcroft had, prior to his death, named his brother trustee of the shop and its earnings until Clementine reached the age of 25, on account of her youth and her unmarried state making her, in the document's careful language, unfit to independently manage estate and trade. Clementine had never seen such a paper in her life. Her father had told her, plainly, more than once, that the shop was hers and hers alone the moment he was gone. But the magistrate in the next township knew Bertram slightly and did not know Clementine at all, and a 19-year-old girl's word carried little weight against a grown man's signature in a document bearing an official seal, however dubiously obtained. She fought it in the only ways available to a girl her age with almost no money and no family standing behind her. She wrote to the territorial court in Helena. She asked the Lutheran minister to speak on her behalf. She even rode 2 days to find a lawyer who might take her case on the promise of future payment, only to be told, gently but plainly, that without money for a proper contest, and without witnesses to counter Bertram's claim, the matter would likely resolve in the way such matters usually resolved, when a young woman stood alone against an older man with paper in his hand. Bertram did not wait for her efforts to bear fruit. Within 2 months, he had taken over the shop's accounts entirely, and within 4, citing her supposed unfitness and the trouble of having her underfoot, he informed her she would need to find lodging elsewhere, since the rooms behind the saddlery were, he said, needed now for storage. He allowed her to take her clothing, her father's all, and a small kit of hand tools too specific to interest him, and precious little else. He did not come to see her off. She stood on the road outside the shop that had been her whole world, 19 years old, with a single trunk and $9 folded in her glove, and she did not cry, though she wanted to, because some stubborn part of her, the part her father had planted at that workbench, the part that looked at ruin and asked what could still be salvaged, was already, even in that raw first hour, beginning to think about what came next. Briar Hollow was not a large enough town to offer many opportunities to a girl in her position, but it was not without kindness either. Clementine took a small room above the mercantile, paying what little she could in advance, and she began doing the only skilled work available to her that did not require capital she no longer had, mending harness and leather goods on a small scale for whoever would trust a young woman alone with the work, which turned out, in that first hard month, to be fewer people than she had hoped. She was 19, and she understood, with the particular clear-eyed bitterness of the young learning an unfair lesson too early, that people's sympathy for her situation rarely translated into their willingness to hand her real business, especially when Bertram, eager to protect his new acquisition from any comparison, had taken to quietly suggesting around town that his niece was flighty, ungrateful, perhaps not entirely reliable, the sort of talk that spreads easily about a young woman with no one to contradict it. She earned enough to keep her room and feed herself barely, and she saved what she could, though it amounted to almost nothing, and it was in this thin, uncertain state that she found herself, on a cold Saturday at the end of that first hard autumn, standing at the edge of a salvage sale behind Higgins' freight yard, where the town periodically cleared out decades of accumulated wreckage, broken wagon frames, split barrels, and shoved into the farthest, weediest corner of the lot, a stagecoach so old and so forgotten that most of the men present had never troubled to ask where it had come from. It was unmistakably one of the old Copper Ridge line coaches, its once painted body gone silver gray with age, one wheel missing entirely, and the rest cracked and sunken into the earth, its leather thorough braces rotted to threads that crumbled at a touch. A faded crest on the door, worn nearly past reading, showed the ghost of lettering, copper ridge line, and beneath it, half swallowed by rust and time, a route name that might once have read Ashwood Landing, a settlement Clementine had heard mentioned only in passing, as one of the small camps upriver that had vanished when its modest gold strike played out decades before she was born. The auctioneer, a wiry, impatient man named Higgins, moved through the lot with barely a glance at the coach when he reached it. "Somebody take this off my hands before it rots into the ground entirely," he said, more complaint than invitation, and the small gathering of ranch hands and freighters laughed, because nobody in their right mind wanted a 100-year-old coach with no wheels and no conceivable use. Clementine, standing near the back with her hands tucked in her coat, sleeves against the cold, found herself stepping forward before she had entirely decided to do so. It was not sentiment that moved her, not yet. It was the same instinct her father had trained into her at the workbench, the instinct that looked past what a thing appeared to be worth and asked, instead, what it might still hold. A coach that useless, she reasoned, should have been broken down for its iron and salvageable wood decades ago. The fact that it had not been felt, to her, like a small and curious mystery all its own. "I'll give you $5 for it," she said, and her voice, though young, did not waver. Higgins looked at her for a long moment. The particular assessing look grown men so often gave her since Bertram's rumors had begun to circulate, and then shrugged, since $5 for a wreck he'd otherwise have to pay to have hauled off was, by his own accounting, no bad trade at all. "It's yours, girl, and good luck to you," he said, and one of the older ranch hands standing nearby murmured to his neighbor, just loud enough for her to hear, that the Ashcroft girl had clearly lost whatever sense her father raised her with. Clementine said nothing. She paid her $5 out of the little she had left, and she walked back to her small room above the mercantile with a strange, steady warmth in her chest that she could not entirely explain even to herself, the same quiet certainty her father used to describe when he picked up a ruined bridle and already knew, somehow, exactly how he meant to save it. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working around the mending jobs that kept her fed, to clear the brush and settled earth away from the old coach and begin, carefully, to examine what she had bought. She was not hunting for treasure. She hoped, mainly, for salvageable iron fittings and sound which she might use or sell, and perhaps the beginnings of some small trade, restoring old furnishings and vehicles, an extension of the mending work she already understood in her hands, if not yet in practice. She pried open the warped door, which groaned on its single remaining hinge, and found the interior more intact than she had dared hope. The horsehair cushions long since disintegrated, but the wooden benches beneath still solid, built by hands that had clearly cared about the work, the way her father had always cared about his. It was while running her palm along the underside of the rear bench, checking the joints for rot the way he had taught her, that her fingers caught on something that should not have been there at all, a seam in the wood too straight, too deliberate, to be any accident of age or damage. She worked at it that evening by the light of a borrowed lantern, using one of her father's smaller chisels with the same patient care he had taught her to bring to any delicate repair, and when the panel finally lifted free with a soft groan of old dust, she found beneath it a shallow compartment built directly into the coach's frame, expertly hidden, the kind of construction that spoke of purpose rather than accident. Inside lay a stiffened leather satchel gone dark and brittle with age, and beside it, wrapped in oiled canvas that had somehow kept the worst of a century's damp away, a small bound journal, its pages foxed but legible, filled with a careful, forward-slanting hand that was unmistakably a young woman's. Clementine sat back on her heels in the cold, hollow coach, the journal open across her knees, and read the first legible entry by lantern light, and felt a slow, prickling chill move down her spine as she understood that the $5 she had spent, out of grief or stubbornness or some inherited instinct she could not fully name, had bought her something considerably more than a wreck of old wood and iron. The journal, as she read on through that long, cold night, belonged to a young woman named Delphine Marsh, who had, by her own account, served as assistant conductor, and, in her final desperate entries, the sole surviving attendant of the Copper Ridge coach that ran between the gold camp of Ashwood Landing and the railhead at Copper Junction in the terrible winter of 1789. Clementine had never heard of Ashwood Landing spoken of as anything but a ghost of a place, a name attached to old stories rather than any location a person could still point to on a map, but Delphine wrote of it plainly, with the careful, unromantic detail of someone recording facts she believed mattered deeply. And what she recorded, entry by patient entry, was the unraveling of a robbery that had gone catastrophically wrong. The coach, according to Delphine's account, had been carrying that December the season's final wages for the camp's mining families, gold coin and dust owed to some 60 or 70 men and their households, sealed and certified by the mining company's agent at Ashwood Landing, meant to carry those families through a winter that promised to be hard, since the camp's richest vein had given out only weeks before. The coach never reached Copper Junction. It was stopped in a high pass by a man Delphine named only as Rourke, an outlaw of some local reputation. Though not, she noted with evident surprise, the reputation of a man who killed easily or without cause. Rourke and two companions had taken the strongbox, and in the chaos that followed, an early blizzard, a panicked team, a driver Delphine called only old Samuel whom she plainly grieved. The coach had gone off the trail entirely, tumbling into a brush-choked ravine and coming to rest, half buried, in a fold of the mountainside the storm sealed off within the hour. Samuel had died in the wreck. One of Rourke's companions had died alongside him. Rourke himself, badly injured and half frozen, had crawled to where Delphine lay, thrown clear before the final plunge and sheltering as best she could against the cold. And it was here, in the pages that followed, that the journal took its strangest and most affecting turn. Rourke, dying by Delphine's careful account over the course of that terrible night, confessed to her not simple greed, but a debt of his own. His own family, he told her, had been cheated of wages and claim rights years before by the very mining company whose payroll now lay scattered in the snow, cheated through methods the company's agents had never been made to answer for. He had meant, he said, to take the gold not for himself, but to see it eventually return to the miners it belonged to rather than let it vanish forever into a company's ledger, as one more loss the families would simply be told to accept. It was, he told her, a debt he had never lived to see repaid, and he asked her, in what Delphine recorded as his final coherent words, to see it done if she could. Delphine, alone in that wreckage with a dying man's confession and a fortune in gold the mining company would certainly claim as its own the moment it was discovered, made a decision the journal recorded with remarkable steadiness for a young woman who must have been half frozen and entirely alone in the dark. She hid the strongbox's contents within the coach's own frame, building the compartment herself over the days that followed while she sheltered in the wreck waiting for the storm to break, intending to return once the confusion settled to see the gold distributed to the very families it had always belonged to, rather than let it disappear into a company's accounting as one more debt the miners would simply be expected to bear without complaint. But Delphine Marsh never made it back. The final entries grew shorter and more labored. Speaking of a fever she feared she had taken from the days of exposure in the ravine, and the journal simply stopped mid-sentence, on a page dated the 11th of January, 1790. Whether she had died there in the mountains or been found and carried away too ill ever to return for what she had hidden, the record could not say. What made plain, beyond any doubt, was that the gold sealed within that coach had never been stolen wealth in any simple sense. It was wages owed, hidden by a young woman trying, in her own quiet and unrecorded way, to see justice finished, nearly 100 years before Clementine Ashcroft ever pried the panel loose. Clementine read the journal through twice that night and did not sleep at all, sitting in the cold, ruined coach with the lantern burning low, feeling the strange, dizzying weight of having been handed by $5 in pure chance, a 100-year-old debt still waiting to be paid. When she finally worked up the nerve to lift the gold fully free of its hiding place, the sight and weight of it filled her not with joy, but with something closer to dread. Dust and coin enough, She guessed even without proper counting, to represent a genuine fortune, more money than she had ever seen or expected to see in her whole young life, and every ounce of it, by Delphine Marsh's own dying record, belonging not to Clementine Ashcroft, but to the descendants of the men who had gone without their winter wages a century before. She thought, sitting there in the cold, of her father's old lesson at the workbench, that value was rarely where people expected to find it, that a thing left for dead was so often only a thing nobody had troubled to look at closely enough, and she understood, with a clarity that would steady her through everything difficult still to come, that she had not been handed a treasure to keep quietly for herself. She had been handed a debt to finish. It took her some weeks of careful, discreet inquiry, conducted around the edges of her mending work, to confirm what she suspected, letters to the county archive in Helena, a long and patient correspondence with an elderly clerk who remembered, dimly, tales of a vanished Copper Ridge coach and a played-out camp once called Ashwood Landing, long since absorbed into open grazing land upriver, before she felt confident enough in what she had found to take the matter further. And it was in the course of that quiet research that she first drew the notice of the man who would try, in the end, to take the discovery from her much as her uncle had taken the shop, only with cooler manners and a thicker layer of respectability. His name was Garrett Doss, and he held, through a tangle of inheritance and land consolidation, controlling interest in the very mining concern whose century-old ledgers Clementine had begun, carefully, to trace. Doss was not, by Briar Hollow's estimation, an obvious villain. He sat on the town's grazing board, contributed generously to the chapel roof fund, and had, on the single occasion their paths crossed before her inquiries began, been perfectly courteous to her, in the mildly condescending way grown men in that country so often were courteous to a girl of 19 they did not expect to trouble them further. But word travels quickly in a town the size of Briar Hollow, and it was not long before Doss understood that the Ashcroft girl had found something concealed in that old wreck behind Higgins' yard, and that whatever it was, if it could be traced back to his company's old accounts, might well be arguable, on paper at least, as belonging to the company rather than to whoever had happened to find it 100 years later. Doss came to see her himself, on a mild afternoon not long after, dressed with the careful modesty of a man who wished to appear entirely reasonable. He did not threaten her outright. He spoke instead of legal complexities, of his company's standing as rightful successor to the original mining concern, of how much simpler and less costly it would be for a young woman alone, without the means to survive a legal contest, to simply hand the matter over to him quietly in exchange for what he called a fair and generous consideration, a sum, Clementine noted at once, considerably smaller than what she had found, offered with the unspoken but unmistakable implication that refusal would mean a fight she had no possible way to win. It was, in its way, an echo of exactly what Bertram had done to her, a grown man with standing and paper wielded against a girl the world had already decided to underestimate, and she felt the old, familiar cold settle into her chest as she listened to him. The particular helplessness of watching someone assume, not unreasonably given her age and her circumstances, that she would simply have no choice but to yield. But Clementine had spent a great many careful nights with Delphine Marsh's journal, and she had not spent them idly. She understood, from her correspondence with the Helena archivist and her own patient reading of the mining company's original charter, preserved in the territorial records, that the payroll gold had never legally belonged to the company past the moment it was certified and sealed for distribution to the named miners. It was, in the charter's own plain language, wages already earned and assigned, held only in trust for delivery. Doss's claim, however confidently he pressed it, rested entirely on the hope that a 19-year-old orphan with no money and no standing would never think, or dare, to look closely enough to know the difference. Clementine had looked closely, and in the course of her research she had found something that turned the whole matter from a quiet private dispute into something the town of Briar Hollow could not easily set aside. A payroll ledger, preserved among the territorial mining records, listing every worker owed wages that terrible winter of 1789, nearly 70 names, and beside a good many of them, family names she recognized instantly, because their descendants still ranched and kept shop and worshipped in Briar Hollow to that very day. She did not fight Garrett Doss in a courtroom because she had no possible way to afford it, and because she understood something Doss, in his confidence, had not accounted for, that the truest justice available to a girl in her position was not a legal victory behind closed doors, but a public one, spoken aloud where everyone could hear it. She carried the ledger and the journal and a careful accounting of names to the Lutheran chapel on a Sunday afternoon, and she asked the minister's permission to speak to the congregation once the service had ended. And there, in front of nearly the whole of Briar Hollow, 19 years old and steady-voiced despite every reason she might have had to falter, Clementine Ashcroft told the story of Delphine Marsh and old Samuel and a dying outlaw's strange, unfinished conscience, and read aloud, carefully and respectfully, the list of names preserved in that century-old ledger. Watching recognition dawn family by family across the room. The Hollis name, whose great-grandfather had died that same terrible winter of a fever the family had always believed was brought on by cold and hardship they never fully recovered from. The Reyes name, whose grandmother had told stories of a winter so lean the family nearly lost their claim and their land alike. A dozen others, ordinary, unremarkable families who had carried, without ever quite understanding why, the long shadow of a debt 100 years unpaid. Garrett Doss, faced not with a lawsuit he might well have won on paper, but with the plain, public knowledge of exactly whose wages he was attempting to claim, found his position considerably less comfortable than he had anticipated. A man who wished to remain welcome on the grazing board, who wished his own children to sit comfortably in that same chapel, could not easily stand before the gathered town and insist that century-old wages, publicly named and proven, rightfully belonged to him rather than to the families who had earned them through their grandparents' labor. He withdrew his claim within the month, quietly, without ceremony or apology, and Clementine never spoke of it afterward as any kind of victory over him, only as a matter finally, properly set right. What followed was not a windfall Clementine kept for herself, though she would have been entitled, by any fair measure, to a considerable portion of it, having found what no one in 100 years had thought to look for. Instead, working with the chapel elders and the small county court, she arranged for the gold to be distributed among the identified descendants of the original miners, in shares calculated as fairly as a century's uncertain records allowed, setting aside, at her own quiet insistence, a portion to repair the chapel roof, which had leaked for 3 winters running, and to establish a small hardship fund for young people in the valley who found themselves, as she once had, alone and without, means through no fault of their own. She kept for herself only enough to buy back, at a fair price and with proper legal documentation this time, a small parcel of land on the edge of town, and to open, at last, a modest shop of her own, with a hand-lettered sign above the door reading simply, C. Ashcroft Leather Saddlery, though the townsfolk came, in time, to speak of it as something more. The place where the Ashcroft girl had found a centuries forgotten debt and finally seen it paid. As for Bertram, justice found him in its own slower, quieter way. Word of Clementine's discovery traveled, as such stories do, and reached the ears of a territorial clerk in Helena who had, some months before, processed an oddly similar guardianship claim and begun, out of nothing more than professional curiosity, to ask questions Bertram Ashcroft had never expected anyone to ask twice. It was not gold that undid him, not treasure or drama, but the plain, patient unraveling of a lie that had counted entirely on no one ever looking closely. The same kind of careful looking that had first led his niece to a seam in an old wooden bench that should not have been there. Bertram lost the saddlery within the year. Forced to sell to cover the costs of a guardianship contest, he could not survive once the questions began in earnest, and he left the territory altogether. And Clementine, when she heard, felt not triumph, but something quieter and more settled. The tired peace of a young woman who had never once sought revenge and had found a kind of justice anyway, simply by refusing to stop believing that broken things and overlooked people could still be set right. We began this story with a girl of 19, standing alone on a rutted road with a single trunk and $9, cast out by a man who believed her too young and too powerless to ever fight back. And we told you she would buy, out of what looked like foolishness, an abandoned stagecoach sealed with a secret that would restore not only her own life, but an entire community's. That girl was Clementine Ashcroft, and what she found sealed inside that 100-year-old wreck was never simply gold. It was a debt left unfinished by a dying outlaw's conscience, and a promise made by a young woman named Delphine Marsh who never lived to keep it herself. Clementine kept it for her. She looked at a thing everyone else had already written off: a rotted coach, a forgotten ledger, a 19-year-old girl with no standing and no money. And she asked, the way her father had taught her at his workbench so many years before, not what is this worth now, but what might this still become? And in answering that question, she did not simply restore her own fortune. She paid, 100 years late, a debt that 70 families never knew they were still owed. And in doing so, she became, in her own quiet and unassuming way, exactly the kind of person Delphine Marsh had died trying to be. Thank you for spending this time with Clementine Ashcroft and the long-buried secret of the Copper Ridge Coach. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked young people are so often worth more than the world assumes. We would love to hear from you before you go. What is a time in your own life when someone underestimated you, or when you found real value in something others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.